Hell's Paradise or Jigokuraku is the newest Studio Mappa production. I made a video covering the first 4 episodes a few weeks back. I had mixed feelings about this show at that point. I mean, just like every other show ever, it had its rough edges. Yeah, the edges in question were a bit rougher compared to other shows, but still, I felt like people, and Twitter because Twitter users aren't real people, were overreacting quite a bit. I won't summarize the entire video here, but basically, this show had plenty of visual flaws. None of them were too severe, but still. This show also had its positives, and I discussed these strengths and flaws in detail. That was the video. And I feel like the team watched it and decided to systematically undo every single one of those strengths from the very next episode. This show looks bad. Not average, not passable, bad. And here's something I need to clarify. This is me criticizing this show's visuals as a fan. I don't hate anyone who worked on this project because of course I don't. Actually, animators work really hard, so you are not allowed to have a negative opinion. Shut up. I know they work hard. This is criticism. Anyway, yeah, this show is hard to watch. One of my main arguments in this show's favor was the fact that every scene didn't need top tier animation, and expecting the same is stupid. At least this show was producing a couple of impressive cuts every episode. Well, not anymore. Episodes 5 through 8 didn't have a single decent looking cut. This show was obviously prioritizing the action, but even the fights were utterly devoid of anything interesting. Episode 9 had a couple of decent-ish cuts, I'll talk more about those in a second, but as a whole, it felt like the life was drained out of this show. Before we go through each episode, let me talk about a huge issue with this show: bad art and off-model frames. Now normally I don't really have a problem with stuff like that. In fact, I try not to bring up those issues, but when every other frame is off-model, I need to talk about it. Two things that can lead to off-model drawings are overly complicated character designs and excessive amounts of movement. This show has neither. The faces are flat with practically no line work and barely any movement, but they struggle to stay on model regardless. There are many instances of the entire facial anatomy being but the eyes look the worst. Their shape keeps changing and the distance between them is often incorrect to a comical degree. And it's not like the storyboards are complicated either. The shots are largely basic and contain minimal line work, but they fall apart anyway. Why does this happen? Well, bad schedules. Rushed work looks bad. Also, if the animation directors don't have enough time to correct these drawings, they end up lacking consistency. Of course, poor in-between animation and traces are a thing. Although, I believe poor corrections and keyframes are largely responsible here. It's not like this show moves all that much, there's only so much damage bad in-between animation can do to a show like this. Another major issue with this show is how stiff it feels. It was an issue from the start, but it has gotten a lot worse lately. The movement feels unnatural, not that there's much of it to begin with. I'll get into more specific examples in a second, but basically, the movement looks bad. A scene might feature an intense fight or a character simply running in a straight line, but either way, the movement looks lifeless. It feels choppy but not in a good way. Of course, the lack of any notable action animators besides Satoshi Iwataki and Toru Takano doesn't help either. The issues with the compositing are still around. I never really had a problem with the green accent work, but the poor foreground-background blending was an issue. The awkward blurring of the background felt, well, awkward. The backgrounds have a lot of detail and I think the blur is there to make sure the audience focuses on the characters. It's also there to make the panning feel less jarring, but surely there are better ways of going about it. Surely blurring the background isn't the most creative way of achieving visual normalcy. It feels like the visual elements were haphazardly thrown together, which they probably were. That is exactly the look compositing is meant to avoid. Making each layer blend in with the next is what compositing is all about, and this aspect keeps getting worse. Anyway, let's go through the episodes. I won't talk about the first 4 of those because I've done so already. Let's start with episode 5. And this episode was incredibly boring. The characters sat around and talked for the most part, and it was animated in the most mundane way imaginable. The classic mouth flap animation. Also, the art was quite inconsistent, and since most of the shots were close-ups, it stood out. Some of the background shots looked nice. At one point, they decided to rotate the scene, making it a Dutch angle shot, probably because they wanted something on screen to move, but it just looks awkward. Although the lighting here isn't bad. The boat scene looks very bland. There are better ways of handling fog. The monsters running around looked laughably bad. They took a PNG, moved it across the screen and added some motion blur on top of it. The action here looked really underwhelming. They did the absolute bare minimum. Although the CGI things moved quite well, probably because their movement was laid out using 2D animation. More visually uninteresting scenes follow. The final bit of action looked quite bad. They tried to do something creative with the flare effects, but it was too short. The movement felt lifeless. It was so stiff and underwhelming. This cut here looks awful. It didn't look like this guy's body got torn apart because of the sheer force. It looked like someone used the lasso tool and deleted part of it. Also, somebody thought this zoom in was a good idea. A professional artist came to the conclusion that slowly zooming in on an already goofy facial expression and lingering on it for nearly 3 whole seconds was a good idea. It was not. This might be the single worst cut in the entire show. This brings us to episode 6, an action-heavy episode which looked very mediocre. The opening bit of action was a convoluted mess. The unnecessary cuts, a random still which ruins the flow, and extremely stiff movement. This fight had it all. Although the background movement looked alright. The big guy goes flying and they didn't animate him hitting anything. The trees, which are a part of the background by the way, mysteriously disappear and a completely different looking broken tree pops out. This cut was so poorly executed, it looked jarring. The scene lacked a sense of depth because it used a flat background. I can appreciate the effort behind a cut like this, but based on the fact that every single thing here is blurred, you can tell how rough it probably looked. This tiny bit of hand animation looked nice. Look at this cut. You've probably seen something like this before. One Punch Man, Vinland Saga, etc. But this looks a lot weaker in comparison, mainly because it's a single weak drawing zooming in. The compositing team tried to add some smears digitally, but it ends up looking like poorly masked spot blurs. This entire fight looks bad. Every bit of movement felt awkward, stiff and lifeless, this shortcut being the only exception. Naturally, the more complex cuts looked even worse. The art throughout this episode was really inconsistent, with lots of off-model frames. The line art near the end looked horribly compressed. It felt out of place and off-putting. Next up, we have episode 7, and I got nothing. It's a boring episode with lots of uninteresting dialogue and off-model frames. The tiny bits of movement looked awkward and stiff, which is to be expected at this point. Although this cut looked nice. Episode 8 contains some action and it's just sad at this point. More weak drawings, more bad compositing and janky movement. At one point, the saturation and vibrance increases for no reason, which looked off-putting. The fight near the end featured a couple of alright looking cuts. Some of the punches felt impactful, which was nice. Although this cut here is heavily ghosted and dimmed. The visuals are supposed to accentuate the intensity of a scene, but the visuals near the end of this episode do the exact opposite. Her body language here looks goofy instead of tragic. Episode 9 actually featured some decent looking cuts. The attacks felt heavy. There's some well done smear work and passable hand-to-hand combat and choreography. It's not perfect, the movement still feels quite choppy and underwhelming. The art was still quite weak, but at least it moved. The digital energy effects actually looked decent, and this exchange felt intense. Also, the effects are unblurred here, which is an interesting choice. They do look good. The visuals go downhill from this point on. The rest of the episode is fairly unremarkable. Episode 10 is another weak one, no surprises there. The movement, especially the action, looked really poor and lifeless. It's the same thing over and over at this point. Hell's Paradise never looked great, but it's visibly falling apart at this point. I was somewhat optimistic when I made this video, but that optimism is gone now. I look like an idiot, and I don't expect this show to come up with a decent looking episode at this point. The cracks in the visuals are impossible to ignore. And you probably know that I don't have an irrational hatred for a studio that some people do. But I have to call a spade a spade. This show looks bad, and it gets worse with every single episode. That's about it. Whatever, check out this other video on screen. Also make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time.